Okay, so welcome all to the free paper session 4, and we have our respected judges here, Dr. Rupa Naik ma'am, Renu Magdum ma'am, and Dr. Nanuma Darade sir. And with the esteemed faculty, we would be starting presentation. And the first presentation for a day is Ravin Punamia. Ravin, have you joined? Dr. Ravin?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah. Please start sharing your screen.
Is my screen visible?
No,
Still not.
not exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Next slide show.
Make it full screen. We'll start your time. Duration is 6 minutes and 2 minutes is question answer.
Good evening, respected judges, my seniors, and my dear colleagues. My topic for today is reliability of rebound tonometry with gold standard tonometer and its correlation with CCT. The aim of my study is to compare the IOP readings taken by rebound tonometry with gold standard with rebound tonometry and gold standard Goldman's apnea tonometer, and to correlate this with the central corneal thickness. Introduction. Measurement of intraocular pressure is a routine investigation in overall eye checkups, and IOP still remains the only modifiable factor in treatment of glaucoma. And lessening of the IOP has shown to decrease the progressive field loss in patients with glaucoma, and therefore the importance of accurate and precise measurement is justified. Goldman's apnea tonometer is considered as a gold standard of measurement. The principle behind it being Imbert fixed law, which depends on the applanation or flattening of the cornea. GAT gives the most accurate value at the corneal thickness of 520 microns. Rebound tonometry, it is usually done by iCare tonometer, which is a handheld device. A very light probe hits the cornea and rebounds back, and an induction-based coil system is used for measuring the motion parameters. The deceleration of the probe and the contact time is calculated into the IOP, and the average is displayed on the device after 6 rebounds per measurement. Higher the IOP, faster is the deceleration, and shorter is the contact time with the cornea. Material and method. This is a cross-sectional observational study. Patients above the age of 18 years coming to the OPD in the month of October 2020 were considered for the study. All the patients were informed and counseled regarding the study, and proper consent was taken. Basic history examination and vision was done. A thorough slit lamp examination of the anterior segment and the dilated fundus examination was done. iCare pressures were recorded, and then GAT was done for both eyes by 2 separate examiners who were masked from each other's results. Central corneal thickness was recorded after the measurement of IOP, and all the data was entered in the Excel sheet for analysis. Measurement was taken from both eyes for the study. Inclusion criteria includes all the patients above 18 years with a normal anterior and posterior segment. Exclusion criteria involve patients below the age of 18 years or mentally ill patients. Corneal pathologies like corneal dystrophy, degeneration, and any opacity or dry eye. Anterior segment pathologies like uveitis or lens-induced glaucoma. Known cases of glaucoma on medical treatment or post-trabeculectomy. Posterior segment pathologies like vitreous hemorrhage, retinal detachment, and diabetic retinopathy. Statistical analysis. Paired t-test was used for the comparison between RBT and GAT. Correlation between RBT and GAT with CCT was determined using Pearson's correlation coefficient. A p-value of less than 0.05 was considered significant. A total of 200 eyes were considered for the study of 100 patients. The male to female ratio was 43:57. Mean age was 65.78 years, and in males it was 65.77 and 65.8 in females. The mean IOP measured by RBT was 14.4 plus minus 3.15 millimeters of mercury, and that by GAT was 14.87 plus minus 3.06 millimeters of mercury. The difference between the mean IOP was 0.47, which is statistically insignificant with a p-value of 0.06. The mean central corneal thickness was 511.1 microns, and in males it was 515.1 plus minus 34.14, and in females it was 508.1 plus minus 33.64 microns. Here we can see a table of correlation of CCT with RBT and GAT. The Pearson correlation for RBT is 0.3425 with a significant p-value, and GAT is 0.3077 with a p-value which is significant. This is a bland Portman chart. which shows the average of RBT and GAT on the x-axis and difference of RBT and GAT on the y-axis. The black line represents the mean difference, which is minus 0.47, and the red dotted lines represent the 95% confidence interval limits, the upper limit being 3.95 and the lower limit being minus 4.89. Discussion. It was observed that RBT values of IOP were slightly lower to those measured by GAT over a range of CCT from 419 microns to 616 microns. The difference in IOP between RBT and GAT was statistically insignificant, with the p-value being 0.06813. Jose et al. And Moreno Montanez et al. Found that the RBT tonometers are known to slightly overestimate IOP as compared to GAT. However, in a study conducted by Nakakura S, they found that the IOP measured by iCare was slightly lower than GAT due to the higher mean age of the patient. And this can be seen in our study as well, where the mean age is 65. Chen et al. And Jose et al. Also stated some disadvantages of GAT, which include it requiring anesthetizing drops, it requiring a fluorescein dye, slit lamp, and a trained examiner. It is also dependent on the corneal pathology, and because it's a contact procedure, it also increases the risk of infection and spread of infection from one patient to the other. iCare tonometer does not require any such anesthesia or fluorescein dye, and it is a relatively easy instrument to use, and it is portable as well. RBT and GAT have shown positive correlation with CCT, RBT being more positively correlated with CCT than GAT. Various other studies have shown similar results. The deviation of IOP readings affected by CCT varies differently between different studies, according to Chen et al. Conclusion. The result of the study demonstrates that iCare rebound tonometer can measure IOP with a relatively small difference in measurement and can provide a reliable reading in comparison with GAT across a wide range of central corneal thickness without hampering the corneal health. Thank you.
Over to judges, please. Stop sharing.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Judges, you can go ahead with your questions.
Dr. Ravin, you have talked about some other studies which had different results from yours. So were the studies, your study done in a different manner, or the mechanism or the methods were exactly the same?
The methods are similar. Both RBT and GAT were taken by two masked examiners, and the statistics was conducted by another masked person who did not perform the examination.
Okay, then your study is mainly on checking the intraocular pressure. So why did you exclude the posterior segment problems patients?
Patients with posterior segment pathologies can also have an effect on increase in IOP.
Yes, but you're measuring the same IOP with two different instruments, and you're seeing how much they differ.
Yes, ma'am.
So was there any other reason for excluding? Hello?
No, ma'am.
Yeah.
Please answer your question quickly so judges can ask you more questions, or you can pass on the question. Otherwise, you will be losing your own scoring thing.
Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Okay. Hello, Ravi.
Yes, sir.
Can this rebound tonometer can be used in pediatric age group?
Sorry, sir.
Can it be used in pediatric age group?
Yes, sir. It can be used in pediatric age group.
Okay. Whether it is FDA approved or not, and when?
Sir, I'm sorry, I don't know that.
Okay. Okay. Over to Rupa, ma'am.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
What is the difference in cost of two tonometer, and which is more beneficial?
Ma'am, I don't know the cost difference.
Okay. So in your view, which tonometer is good?
Ma'am, GAT is considered as a gold standard, but in patients in which there are any corneal pathologies, we can use eye care as an alternative method,
Okay.
and it can provide us with a reliable IOP.
Okay. So one should have that one. Okay. Okay. You must have told about the cost also. No? Okay. Okay. It's all right. All right. All right. Okay.
Okay. Okay,
Bye.
no problem.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we'll move on to our next speaker, Dr. Bennett Matthew, and he will be talking on predisposing factors for iris claw lens implantation. Over to you, Dr. Bennett. Your time starts now.
Am I audible?
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
Good evening, judges, seniors, and my dear colleagues. Today, my topic is predisposing factors for iris claw lens implantation, a study at a tertiary eye care center in central India. There's no financial or personal interest involved in this presentation. So the aim of the study was to evaluate preoperative and intraoperative indications of iris claw lens implantation and to analyze visual outcome of retropupillary fixation of iris claw lens as a primary surgery. The complete visual recovery in aphakia has always been a challenge for every ophthalmologist. We know that spectacles and contact lenses have been in the scene for a long time, but surgical methods for aphakia are considered the best, and the options include scleral fixated intraocular lenses, angle supported anterior chamber intraocular lenses, and iris claw lens. Anterior chamber lenses, as we know, are associated with an increased corneal decompensation and secondary glaucoma. Esophyles, as we know, preserve the anatomical integrity but are time consuming and require high technicality. Iris claw was invented by Wurst in 1980. The advantages of iris claw lens as compared to esophyal is that the implantation is technically easy. And as compared to anterior chamber IOLs, it reduces the risk of corneal endothelial damage. But at the same time, there are few disadvantages, like there's a high incidence of pupillary distortions and iris atrophy, along with secondary glaucoma. There may be a wound suture related astigmatism in cases where sutures are used, and it's a bit costlier than the regular lens, regular posterior chamber intraocular lens. So the study we did was a retrospective study. We used the data of 3 years from January 2017 to December 2019. We included patients with surgical aphakia with poor capsular support. All of our patients underwent manual small incision cataract surgery. Preoperative assessment included regular examination as done for every cataract patient. The iris claw lens used in our study was Excellence, which is a PMMA biconvex iris lens with a total length of 8 millimeter and an optic size of 5.5 millimeter. The A constant was 117.2, and we preferred the SRKT formula for IOL power calculation. During the normal manual SICS, once the iris claw lens was indicated, we made a paracentesis followed by an anterior vitrectomy, after which pilocarpine was injected to induce the meiosis, which was followed by the implantation of iris claw lens, and a peripheral iridectomy was done. Rest, the case was closed as in every normal case with a subconjunctival injection of antibiotic and steroid. Postoperative regimen of topical steroid and antibiotic was given in every patient for about 1 month, and normal regular follow-up was done on the first day, 7th day, first month, and if required, up to 6 months. The results of the study, 144 aphakic eyes were enrolled in the study. Of this, as I had mentioned, we enumerated the predisposing factors as well as the intraoperative factors. Among the predisposing factors, 61 of the eyes, that is 42.36% of the total eyes, predisposing factors, of which phacodonosis was the most common one. Among the intraoperative factors, capsular bag delivery was the most common factor which indicated iris claw lens implantation. The average postoperative mean best corrected visual acuity in our study was improved to logMAR 0.50 from that of preoperative logMAR 1.30. So the demography of the study, as you are seeing, it was dominated by the female population. As I mentioned, among the preoperative factors, the most common one was phacodonosis, which was present in almost 60% of the patients. Among the intraoperative factors, the most common one was the bag, which came out during nucleus delivery or collapse in about 32% of the cases, while posterior capsular rent was seen in 25% of the cases. The other factors were sonular dehiscence and subluxation. Among the postoperative complications in the patients, the permanent complications like pupillary distortion and iris atrophy was seen in 27% and 11.8% respectively. Other postoperative complications like secondary glaucoma, hyphema, transient hypertony, IOL tilt, and postoperative cystoid macular edema were resolved by medical management. Discussing the study, as we all know, iris glow lens is in its prominence as compared to anterior chamber IOLs and SFIOLs over the past few decades. In our study, as I had mentioned before, the most significant intraoperative factor which led to iris glow implantation was capsular bag delivery, followed by posterior capsular rent. Predatory et al. In the study, which was conducted in 2018, had stated that posterior capsular rent, which amounted up to 47.6% of its patients, as the most common cause, followed by traumatic subluxation and solar dialysis. Our series had a preoperative mean best corrected visual acuity of logMAR 1.30, which improved to 0.50. And it was specifically to mention that 97% of our patients achieved a final best corrected visual acuity, which was better than the preoperative best corrected visual acuity. The results were very comparable to Mansouri et al. Study and Kelkar et al. Study. Another significant study which I would like to mention was by Madhivanan et al., who compared iris glow lens to SFI lenses, whose improvement was just as similar to ours, but he had noticed that iris glow lenses had a better visual improvement compared to SFIs. As I had mentioned before, among the complications, pupillary distortion and iris atrophy was common in ours, which was similar in Predatory et al. And Charaguis et al. Study. But Mansouri et al. Had reported that ocular hypertension to be the predominant complication, which was followed by an oval pupil. Considering the study can be has a scope of conducting a comparative study with SFIL, as well as the follow-up period was shorter one. So a longer follow-up period would indicate a better study. On concluding, I would like to tell that intraoperative capsular bag delivery is the main intraoperative cause of posterior cap support. Improved expertise reduces the complication, and iris glow lens remains the chief solution. Thank you.
Over to judges now.
Bennett,
please stop
what do you
sharing
mean
your
by
screen,
primary
Bennett. Please
and
stop sharing
secondary
your
iris
screen.
glow?
Excuse me, sir?
What do you mean by primary and secondary iris glow?
So primary iris glow is in the cases in which we take up for cataract surgery and the iris glow is implanted in the first setting itself. Secondary iris glow are the patients we take up in the second setting. For example, any patient may come up after a cataract surgery which was left aphakic, or maybe a traumatic subluxation after an IOL implantation.
Your study was secondary or primary?
No, sir. Our study was exclusively.
Okay, so what formula you used for IOL power calculation?
So SRKT formula was used for IOL power calculation.
But which is a ideal formula?
So the ideal formula would be Haigis formula.
What is that Haigis formula?
Sir, Haigis formula, sir, it involves use of 7 components, 7 factors. Sir, I'm not sure about the formula exactly.
Okay, okay. Over to Magdum, ma'am.
Yes, and Dr. Bennett.
Yes, ma'am.
You've written your title as predisposing factors for iris glow IOLs. Do you think it is the right title to give to this study? You could use the word indications. I think that would have been better.
Yeah.
Right? Indication and visual outcome in iris glow implants.
Yes, ma'am. Yes? Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right.
Any other questions?
Yes, I wanted to know how SFIOL is not good and this iris glow lens is good. Means iris glow lens is better than the SFIOL?
No, ma'am. Our study didn't compare. I had mentioned in the second last slide that we had a scope of comparing it with the SFIOLs.
Okay.
And since our center being a high volume center, we rely on iris glow lenses because most of the cases were in the primary setting and anterior segment surgeons were handling the cases. So in a primary setting, for anterior segment surgeon, once the indication was seen intraoperatively, it's always easier to implant an iris glow lens.
Okay. How can manage a complication with iris glow lenses?
Excuse me, ma'am, I didn't get the question.
Yes. What about the complications of iris claw lenses? And
Yes,
how?
ma'am.
What about the management? I am asking.
Ma'am, among the complications, the most common ones in ours was the pupillary distortion and iris atrophy, which can't be managed post-operatively because it's a permanent complication. But apart from that, secondary glaucomas are present, which we had managed medically, and iris claw lens tilt was present in 2 patients, which was taken for retucking on the post-operative day 1.
Okay. Good.
You mentioned about ovalization of the pupil. How will you manage ovalization if it's more?
Sir, if ovalization is more, sir, once the tucking is done, we prefer not to go surgically. So maybe we can try pilocarpine on post-operative day 1.
Okay. Over to Sumit.
Yes, thank you, sir. And we'll go ahead with the third presentation by Dr. Abhishek Patel. Dr. Abhishek, you can start your presentation.
Am I audible?
He'll be talking. Yes, very much. Please make it full screen.
My screen?
Yeah, everything
Okay.
is full. Please make it full screen. He'll be talking about reducing the incidence of ENDORF by proper operative protocols. Please start.
Good evening, everyone. My title of a free paper is The Role of Proper Operative Protocol in Reducing Incidence of Endophthalmitis in a Tertiary Eye Care Center. The post-operative endophthalmitis is a devastating complication and disaster for surgeon, institute, and patient. The cataract surgery is one of the most common operative performed surgery in India. 90% of post-operative endophthalmitis occur with cataract surgery. The incidence of post-operative endophthalmitis was declined in recent time because of the change in the surgical technique, sterilization procedure, and the better understanding of a risk factor. Globally, the incidence of endophthalmitis is 0.02 to 0.26%. In the study, we have studied a decrease in endophthalmitis rate compared to the previous year in our hospital and overall compared with the other study. The pre, intra, and post-operative protocol followed, which helped our institute to reduce the incidence of post-operative endophthalmitis. It's a retrospective observational study of 2 years, data collected from a computerized record system. The population study was the patient undergoing cataract surgery in the DBCS program. Inclusion criteria: the patient undergoing age-related cataract extraction and the documented follow-up at our institute. Exclusion criteria: the patient undergoing the procedure elsewhere and combined procedure with cataract or post-traumatic cataract or pediatric cataract extraction. The detailed systemic evaluation, including blood sugar and blood pressure, fitness, is obtained from the physician. Routine ocular examination done by ROPLAS check. Syringing done if necessary. Topical antibiotic moxifloxacin was started 1 hour prior day for surgery. Special attention was given to the patient hygiene. Separate surgical gown, feet cover, head cap was provided to each patient. Periocular area of operating eye was cleaned with a spirit soap before giving anesthesia. After giving peribubble block, the povidone iodine 5% drop was inserted in eye and patched with a sterile gauze before shifting patient into the OR. The surgical hand was done by the surgeon and assistant nurse from finger to elbow with 7.5% betadine scrub for 5 minutes. The intraoperative protocol, the new set was given for each and every patient. The separate instrument trolley covered with a sterile cotton towel covered with a sterile plastic sheet. We use painting with a povidone iodine 500 solution twice, followed by disposable plastic drape for the applied. After placing the eye speculum, thorough wash was given with the BSS. MICS was performed. The wound integrity was checked, and at the end, the wound is covered with a conjunctiva with help of a cautery. At the end, 0.1 ml of antibiotic moxifloxacin 0.5 weight by volume injected intracameral in all cases. Subconjunctival antibiotic steroid is injected, and lastly, the sterile eye patch is placed. This is the standard protocol we follow for instrument sterilization according to NABH at our hospital. This is the OT sterilization protocol which we follow, which help us to reduce the cases of endophthalmitis. The post-operative protocol we follow, all the patients are kept admitted for 1 day post-operatively. At the time of discharge, detailed and verbal and written precaution instructions were given. Topical antibiotic plus steroid was started in the tapering dose. Post-operative follow-up was 1 week, 1 month, and 3 months as advised. Patient living in a far area, the follow-up was arranged at the respective PHC centers. When the endophthalmitis is suspected, the diagnosis was confirmed by vitreous biopsy, AC tab, and clinical examination. Culture and sensitive test of the collected sample was done. Surgical complications such as posterior capsular tear or vitreous loss is recorded from the patient operative sheet data. The result, a total of 40,000 surgery were performed in our study period. We have divided them into the 2 groups from 2018 to 2019 and 2019 to 2020. As you can see in the table, there were 10 endometrial cases in 2018-19, while there are only 3 cases in 2019-20. This is the spectrum of a surgeon did to perform surgery, consist of consultant, senior resident, and junior resident. This is the table showing the comparison rate of the endophthalmitis versus the complication of PCR. And this is the table showing the positive agent in a culture report of endophthalmitis cases. More than 50% of samples shows no growth in both the groups. The clinical endophthalmitis incidence in India is between 0.04 to 0.15. In the 2 large eye care facility of India, the incidence was 0.08 and 0.16. Our hospital operates more than 100 intraocular surgery per day, which include 80% of patients belong from the rural area with all spectrum of surgeon. Our institute rate of infectious endophthalmitis was only 0.015%. The main change what we did in 2019-20 was the introduction of the intracameral antibiotic moxifloxacin at the end of a surgery. The rate of endophthalmitis decreased drastically by 3-fold comparing to both the years. A similar study was conducted by Haripriya et al. Shows that the intracameral moxifloxacin prophylaxis reduced the endophthalmitis rate by 3.5-fold, 3-fold in MICS and nearly 6-fold in phacoemulsification. Harrington as well as the clinical trial of ESR showed the significant benefit of intracameral moxifloxacin to reduce the rate of endophthalmitis. PCR is the most common intraoperative complication. In our study, the rate of PCR in rate of endophthalmitis was very less. Statistical was insignificant, but Vaughan et al. Report that the intraoperative PCR association associated with 8 to 11-fold high risk of postoperative endophthalmitis. Haripriya et al. showed that PCR is a major risk factor of endophthalmitis, but intracameral moxifloxacin helped to reduce the rate of the infection. In the hygiene healthcare was very important. So use of povidone iodine eye drop, povidone scrub, and povidone iodine solution for dripping were emphasized. The use of povidone was backed by the study by Speaker and Makhanoff that suggests the significant lower incidence of positive culture endophthalmitis was observed in the operating room using povidone iodine. The gloves are changed in every case in our setup, but it was contradicted by the study by Ravindra et al. Suggests that the changing of surgical gloves and gown after each case does not reduce the risk of infection. In conclusion, with a proper monitoring and revolution, all the preoperative, intraoperative, postoperative protocol helped institute to give a best surgical outcome. In our study, we reduced the incidence by 3 times. Thank you.
Dr. Abhishek, can you please stop sharing your screen? Over to the judges.
Dr. Abhishek.
Yes, sir.
Whether Fogger is good or routine formalin fumigation is good for OT?
Sir, earlier we used to do fumigation, but according to NABH, we have stopped the fumigation and started using fogging.
Okay. What new you have done in your study? What innovation you have done in your study?
Sir, at the main...
This is the routine you have presented, right?
Yeah, actually the main changes we done in 2019-20 was the introduction of intracameral antibiotic moxifloxacin, which helped us to reduce by almost the case was reduced from 10 to 3, and which was supported by the other studies also. So I think the main was the use of intracameral antibiotic. Second thing, we have started giving individual OT scrub to each and every patient, so that we can reduce the bacterial load inside our OR. And thirdly, as I said, the PCR, the infection rate in PCR with the help of intracameral antibiotic was very less.
Okay. Okay. Over to Magdum, ma'am.
Dr. Abhishek, does this study add anything to our existing knowledge? Because these guidelines have been given several times by so many societies. AIOS is also given. So all this is quite well known. So does this study add anything?
Ma'am, after NABH accreditation at our hospital, these are the few changes we have introduced in last year, which help us to reduce the rate. So the intracameral moxifloxacin was the first time we introduced last year.
Yeah, so, but that is being used by many people since many years. So I think, is there anything else that you feel that you have done a little differently?
Lately, ma'am, we have stopped the fumigation and converted into fogging, and use of the few solution which we use for intraoperative cleaning, like bacillicides.
Okay, so thank you.
Over to Rupa ma'am.
Yes.
Rupa ma'am.
Hi. Can you differentiate TAS from the endophthalmitis? And what happens in camp surgery? How can you prevent endophthalmitis?
Ma'am, as I said, our majority of protocol was based on the pre-operative and intraoperative thing. The pre-operative will give most important to the patient hygiene first, because majority of the patients are poor from a poor background, so hygiene was questionable for them. So we have introduced separate OT gown for each and every patient so that the bacterial load inside the OT will reduce. Secondly, to avoid this infection, endophthalmitis in a camp setup, we have introduced this intracameral moxifloxacin, which have given us a good result. Lastly, the TAS is basically the sudden inflammation inside the interior chamber, mostly present in the next day immediately. Endophthalmitis can be immediately or maybe late, but TAS can be resolved with a steroid. And
Okay. Okay, good.
Okay. Okay.
Bye.
Over to Sumit, Dr. Sumit.
Yes, sir. So we'll start with next presentation by Dr. Barnita Das, the tale of trespassing neighbor. Dr. Barnita, you can start presenting.
Am I audible, sir?
Very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Barnita, and I'll be presenting the next paper of this session. These are my self-declarations. Coming to introduction, sinuses and the orbit are the neighbors in the two cells due to the close anatomical relationship. As evident from this picture, 60 to 80% of the osseous eye socket is made up of sinus walls, and thus orbit is susceptible to the diseases from the sinuses. Out of all cystic malignancies, less than 1% belong to the sinuses, out of which 80% arise from the maxillary sinus. These malignant neoplasm of sinuses can extend beyond the sinuses in 75% of the cases, out of which in 45% of the cases they invade the orbit. Thus, a thorough and systematic evaluation of an orbital lesion can help in their early diagnosis, locate the origin of the disease, and improve the high mortality rate. Now, let us come to our case report. We have a 47 years old male who came to us with the chief complaint of a growth below and medial to left eye since last 9 months, along with pain and bleeding from the mass. The patient started having a growth over the inferior aspect of left eye, which was gradually progressive in nature, along with pain over the mass, and there was bleeding from the lesion as well as from the left nostril and nasal blockage since the beginning. The patient also gave history of generalized fatigue and unexplained weight loss since last 4 months. His past and family history were not significant. The patient lost his appetite since last 4 months. He had a disturbed sleep pattern due to the pain. He is a chronic alcoholic and tobacco chewer. So the first photos of the patient 8 years back and the second photo at the time of presentation. Coming to general physical examination, the patient was conscious, coherent, and cooperative at the time of examination with thin build and poor nourishment. He had 2 submental, 1 left submandibular, and 1 left upper jugular palpable neck lymph nodes. His vitals and systemic examination were within normal limit. There was a fleshy growth extending from the lateral wall of left nostril, and it was pushing the septum to the opposite side. As you can see in the picture, it was lobulated in shape, red in color, irregular margins, and bleeding was noted. A mass was also visible in the oral cavity, depressing the heart palate from above. His visual acuity in right eye was 6/9 and in left eye 6/24 with pinhole. Color vision was normal in both eyes syringing was positive. On inspection, there was a mass over the inferior aspect of left eye, and there was upward pushing of the left orbit, and because of these, facial and ocular symmetry were lost. Coming to examination of periocular region, there was a fleshy burst or growth through the skin, 1 mm inferior medial to the left medial punctum and extending along the malar prominence till the lateral 1/3 of the lower eyelid. As you can see here, it was lobulated in shape, red in color, irregular margins, roll out edges, hard in consistency, immobile. There was a brownish black eschar with blood clot at one edge, and bleeding was noted from the mass. On palpation, it was tender. Mass could not be palpated separately from the medial half of maxillary bone and the inferior orbital margin. Extraocular movement ductions were normal as well as the versions. On slit lamp examination, there was grade 3 mechanical atrophy of left lower lid, and fundus examination showed choroidal folds as is visible here, and there was a nasal tilting of the vertically oval optic disc in left eye fundus due to stretching by the mass. So our provisional diagnosis was left eye sinoazo-orbital mass, possibly malignant for further evaluation. So these were the working DDs in our mind. It can be either a malignancy of left nose and sinuses, which was extending to left orbit, or it can simply be a basal cell carcinoma of the skin. Routine investigations were found to be normal. This is CT orbit axial scan, and it is showing hypodense exophytic lesion starting from inferior medial aspect of left orbit, which was pushing the orbit towards outside, and there was a midline shift. Also, there was a diffuse erosion of left ethmoid and maxillary sinus walls along with the left orbital walls, and calcification was noted. This is CT orbit coronal scan. As you can see here, extraocular muscle and optic nerve were free from the lesion. Incisional biopsy was carried out, and this is a histopathology report. And these are the magnified views showing tumor cells arranged in nests and papillary pattern with intercellular bridges. And this is a typical bizarre looking tumor cell with vesicular nuclei, prominent nucleoli, eosinophilic scant cytoplasm. These are the inflammatory cells in the stroma, hemorrhage within the blood vessel, mitotic figure, and necrosis. So it was suggestive of non-keratinizing squamous cell carcinoma. Immunohistochemistry showed poorly differentiated carcinoma favoring squamous origin. So our final diagnosis was poorly differentiated squamous cell carcinoma, probably non-keratinizing type of left maxillary and ethmoid sinuses extending to left nasal cavity and left orbit. Patient was treated symptomatically for pain relief when neoadjuvant chemotherapy first cycle was started. Now, this was the result after first cycle of chemo. As you can see, both the infraorbital and nasal mass decreased in size, and visual acuity was both by 6/24 with pinhole 6/9. Now, coming to discussion, non-keratinizing squamous cell carcinoma of sinonasal tract is a rare entity arising from the malignant proliferating cells of the respiratory epithelium. The incidence of sinonasal tract malignancy itself is 2.6 per 1 lakh of Asian
1
population.
minute left. 1 minute
Out of which 15 to 20% of these are non-keratinizing type. The most common site being the maxillary antrum. Males develop at a younger age than the female, but prognosis is better in them. WHO classification also lists this variant of carcinoma with ribbon-like growth pattern, cytological atopy, and lack of keratinization. As far our knowledge goes, only 6 case reports have been mentioned so far about this variant of carcinoma, and these are those 6 case reports. However, no case reports so far have mentioned orbital invasion and cervical lymphadenopathy at presentation, and this is how our case is a unique one. According to reports, advanced local disease worsens the prognosis and treatment depends on the tumor location and extent. Surgery is the main modality of treatment, but chemotherapy can be given as neoadjuvant therapy or postoperatively. This case report also emphasizes on the importance of the systemic examination in an orbital lesion. It also points towards delay in seeking medical attention due to the ongoing pandemic. So these are few case reports which shows that after COVID-19 pandemic, there were increased number of extensive tumors.
Time up.
Also, this data from our hospital also shows the same thing. Now, coming to conclusion, NKCA should be included as a DD of such aggressive sinonasal tract carcinoma. A thorough evaluation of all the system is of very much important, and imaging, histopathology, and immunohistochemistry can pinch to the diagnosis and can help in targeted management. These are my references. At last, where there is hope, there is life. So, amidst all the chaos going on, please keep your hope alive and keep living. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. You can stop sharing now. Please, over to judges.
Dr. Barnita,
Yes,
a sinus tumor invading orbit, what is the more common type? Which type is more common?
Squamous cell carcinoma.
Squamous cell carcinoma. Incidence?
Yes, sir.
Incidence, what is the incidence?
Sir, total sinonasal tract carcinoma is 2.6 per 1 lakh population. Exact incidence of squamous cell carcinoma, I did not get, sir. But they say it is the most common type.
Okay. So next question for you is what you advise while doing CT scan in these patients?
Sir, I advise 2 mm cut section, axial and coronal scan, sir.
At what level? CT scan should be particular at what level in this case, sinus tumor with orbit?
Sir, at the level of this sinus, starting from the sinus, sir, I advise. I don't know, sir, exactly.
Okay. Over to Renu, ma'am.
Yes. Is there any difference in the prognosis of the two differential diagnoses in this tumor? Squamous cell carcinoma and the sinonasal carcinoma?
Ma'am, sinonasal carcinoma can be a DD of sinonasal carcinoma's one type variant is squamous cell carcinoma, ma'am. And it is having a worse prognosis, ma'am. If there is a locally invasive disease, then prognosis is bad, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Rupa, ma'am.
Yes.
Yes,
Rupa,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Any questions, ma'am?
can you add some lines about recent mucormycosis?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, after this COVID-19 pandemic, ma'am, this mucormycosis has increased rampantly in India, ma'am. So it is mainly due to untreated diabetes mellitus. Then it is due to steroid use, tocilizumab use during the COVID-19 treatment, ma'am. So as well, a few days back in our hospital also we have diagnosed one case, ma'am. There was one.
Early diagnosis prevent mucormycosis.
Ma'am,
early diagnosis.
Ma'am, I can get it.
We can save the eye.
In mucormycosis, yes, ma'am. Definitely, ma'am. We can save that.
Okay. Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Just
you.
a note to the judges.
Yeah.
Dr. Barnita, who just presented, got diagnosed as a COVID a day before. She is in quarantine and under treatment. We gave her option to present later, but then she very courageously said that she want to present today itself. And though she is in quarantine, she managed a presentation and she answered all the questions very well. She does need a pat on the back and the applaud from all the faculty and the judges and her colleagues that she is doing everything and even presenting when she is herself diagnosed as a COVID. Very well done, Dr. Barnita. We are very proud of.
Congratulations and great work, Dr. Barnita.
Yes, very commendable. Very commendable.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Although I'm doing fine, ma'am, actually.
Okay.
And also,
take care, Barnita. Please take care.
Okay.
Sorry, ma'am.
Wish you very speedy recovery and well done.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yes. So we'll move ahead with the next presentation with Dr. Anujit Paul. In
Good
between,
evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am.
Just a second. Dr. Sai Suchitra could not present because she has a COVID duty. She will be presenting next Sunday. So number 6 is not presenting. We are number 5 is not presenting. We are going to number 6 directly to Dr. Anujit Paul. You can start now.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Very much.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. Good evening to the esteemed panel and my colleagues. I will be presenting a case report titled Basal encephalocele with morning glory syndrome presenting as chronic dacrocystitis. Morning glory syndrome is a congenital optic disc anomaly wherein we see a funnel-shaped excavation of the optic disc surrounded by a central tuft of gliosis and a white annulus of chorioretinal pigmentation with an abnormal vasculature surrounding the optic disc. In general, morning glory syndrome has a well-established association with basal encephalocele and usually presents with midline craniofacial anomalies. Encephaloceles in general are congenital anomalies of the central nervous system through which a part of the brain herniates through, and they are also associated with morning glory syndrome as well. We present a case that presented in our OPD of a 45-year-old female complaining of watery discharge in her left eye for the past 20 years. In her past history, she had a history of a lacrimal abscess 5 years back for which incision drainage was performed elsewhere. Her visual acuity in her right eye was perception of light, and in the left eye was 20/20. Our systemic examination revealed nothing significant. On examination of the eye, surface examination, there was orbital asymmetry, there was hypertelorism, there was a broad nasal bridge with a compressive soft tissue swelling in the inferior nasal aspect of the medial canthus on the left-hand side. Regurgitation test was performed, which was positive, and following which we did lacrimal syringing that confirmed the blockage of the left nasolacrimal duct, whereas the right one was patent. Fundus examination of the right eye revealed a pale funnel-shaped excavation of the optic disc with central gliosis and arteriolar attenuation, and vessels were arranged like the form of a spokes of the wheel, and there was central sheathing and a concentric ring of pigment around the optic disc. Fundus examination of the left eye revealed nothing significant. We took up the patient for investigations and a CT brain was done, and as to our surprise, it revealed a bony defect in the floor of the anterior cranial fossa and the cribriform plate, which is marked with a white arrow on the image on the upper right-hand side. A portion of the frontal lobe was seen herniating through this defect into the anterior ethmoidal sinus and the medial canthal region. Subsequently, CT dacrocystography was performed, and the left lacrimal sac was displaced superiorly. Bilateral dehiscence of the proximal part of the nasolacrimal duct was also seen. With all this in mind, we took up the patient for bifrontal craniotomy with the help of the neurosurgical team, and for excision of the encephalocele and for repairing the defect. And for repairing the defect, we use a tensor fascia lata graft, which you can see over here in the post-operative CT image. Following this entire repair, there was a notable resolution of the epiphora of the patient. Following which, an observant approach was chosen for the lacrimal sac pathology due to spontaneous remission of the epiphora and to avoid any inadvertent neurological sequelae that may result from intervention in an asymptomatic patient. Discussion. We all know that morning glory syndrome is associated with a plethora of ophthalmic findings, which may include persistent hyperplastic primary vitreous, primary pupillary remnants, aniridia, microphthalmos, foveal hypoplasia, lid hemangiomas, ciliary body cysts, Duane syndrome, and pre-retinal gliosis. Sometimes serous and rhegmatogenous retinal detachments have been reported as well. However, chronic dacryocystitis has not been reported, and it forms a conspicuous association in this patient with MGS, and this conjunction is of rare significance. Coming to encephaloceles, these are caused by a defect in the development of the calvarial bones and herniation of intracranial contents through them. Encephaloceles are classified as syncypital as well as basal. Morning glory syndrome has customarily been associated with basal encephaloceles, as we have seen with our case as well. Consistent reported features of encephalocele remain hypertelorism, a broad nasal root, compressive cystic mass in the nasal or the epipharyngeal region, all consistent with our findings. However, chronic dacryocystitis is an unprecedented accompaniment of MGS as well as basal encephalocele. We speculate that this has resulted from a mass effect of the encephalocele on the lacrimal drainage pathway on the left-hand side, or due to a dehiscence of the proximal part of the nasolacrimal duct.
1
So
minute left.
bilateral dehiscence of both nasolacrimal duct is noted in this patient, but this is quite a common preoperative finding. But the resolution of epiphora and repair of the encephalocele offers collaborative evidence. Therefore, neuroimaging may reveal an intricate relation between the herniated mass to the lacrimal sac. Various reports in literature have advocated surgical management of encephalocele to prevent the mass effect, and have also recommended an endoscopic or transsphenoidal approach. In our case, we chose a bifrontal craniotomy with excision of the herniating mass and anterior cranial fossa repair, which resulted in a gratifying outcome with resolution of epiphora and resolution of symptoms. So in conclusion, MGS may be associated with basal encephalocele, and in our case is contralateral. Chronic dacryocystitis is a rare synchronous manifestation. MGS coupled with contralateral basal encephalocele is an unusual entity, and chronic dacryocystitis forms a discernible association with MGS in our region. In this case, thank you very much.
Over to the judges. Dr. Anujit, please stop sharing.
Hello.
Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Anujit, what are the non-ocular findings in morning glory syndrome? What can be non-ocular finding in morning glory syndrome?
Sir, as I mentioned, it has various associations and is associated with calvarial defects. One of them is corpus callosum agenesis. One of them are encephaloceles, as we have reported. Sometimes it may be associated with regression of the calvarian bones as well, sir.
Okay. What is the differential diagnosis of morning glory disc?
So the differential diagnosis of morning glory disc can be any other congenital optic disc anomaly. For example, optic disc hypoplasia, tilted disc syndrome. Sir,
any specific which can be misdiagnosed as morning glory? That can be misdiagnosed as morning glory.
Sir, optic disc coloboma.
Okay. Over to Renu ma'am.
So why is it important to have this differential with coloboma? Are there any systemic features which are more common in colobomas and have to be ruled out? Do you know the acronym CHARGE?
No. Yes, ma'am.
There's an acronym charge, no, with the manifestations of coloboma of the optic disc. So why is this? What is the reason for this morning glory syndrome to happen?
Ma'am, it is a type of optic disc hyperplasia. The vessels that form around the optic disc are splayed, and they result in a sort of a spokes of the wheel pattern. And other than that, the optic disc is larger in size and does not conform to its normal size and shape.
Do you know the
And ma'am,
Moya syndrome associated with this?
Yes, ma'am.
What is that?
Ma'am, it is, ma'am, a vascular disorder, ma'am, involving the carotid artery, which result in reducing blood supply to the basal ganglia. And it's seen as a puff of smoke appearance in neuroimaging.
Yes, okay.
Over to Rupa, ma'am.
So what's the message you wanted to give to the other peoples? And what about any other systemic association? Just now, madam discussed one syndrome. What are any other syndrome which is associated, or any other systemic disease which is related to the chronic disease, dacrocystitis?
The message that I would like to give is for a patient presenting with chronic dacrocystitis for long-standing duration with no resolution, maybe a closer look at the fundus would give us an idea for the dacrocystitis, and maybe neuroimaging may give us an indication of a space-occupying lesion or a mass, or in this case, an encephalocele, which is the actual cause of dacrocystitis and not a lacrimal gland or duct pathology by itself, ma'am.
Okay, good.
Okay, over to Dr. Sumit.
Any more questions from the judges?
No.
Okay, sir. So we'll proceed with the next presenter.
Yeah.
Dr. Maya, who will be presenting on ocular surface melanoma. Dr. Maya, please start your presentation.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Maya Paul M. I'm here to present a case of ocular surface melanoma, a rare association of xeroderma pigmentosa. Xeroderma pigmentosa is a rare autosomal recessive disorder caused by defective repair of DNA damage caused by UV light. Reported incidence of xeroderma pigmentosa in US and Europe are 1 in 250,000 population, and Japan is slightly higher. Data concerning Indian incidence is not known. Till date, 37 unrelated families with patients were reported in India, mostly from the southern part, according to ICMR data 2015. Malignant melanoma is a malignant neoplasm of epidermal melanocytes. The order of frequency of ocular neoplasms in xeroderma pigmentosa are SCC, BCC, fibrosarcoma, and rarely melanoma. Conjunctival melanoma is by itself a rare tumor, constituting 2 to 3% of ocular melanomas, extremely rare association of xeroderma pigmentosa. A 17-year-old female came to our department with she was normal 4 months back, and she noticed a brownish.
When she told me, I knew that Moya is a thing, but it did not strike. And she said,
noticed
like, yes, it is something disorder.
Excuse me. She noticed a brownish black discoloration in the temporal part of her left eye. Later, at the same location, a brownish black mass started growing.
Like puff smoke appearance. Then like, what is the word? Puff smoke. I've seen it, and I was thinking,
excuse me, I can hear some voices.
This is something I learned as a resident. When you're seeing some sort of damage in the ocular surface,
she noticed a sudden increase.
Write the word do CT or MRI. What if you're wrong?
Just a minute, Dr. Maya. There is some cross connection.
Please look into.
Yeah. Technical team, can you see who is unmute and what is happening? Abhijit Paul.
And then I ultimately
mute yourself. Host, can you mute Anujit Paul? Host. Okay. Anujit Paul, you need to mute yourself. Okay. Dr. Maya, I think you can restart.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
A 17-year-old female presented to our department. She was apparently normal 4 months back. She noticed a brownish black discoloration in temporal part of her left eye. Later, at the same location, a brownish black mass started growing. She noticed a sudden increase in size of the lesion spreading to the whole eye in past 1 month with complete loss of vision, attained the present size in 4 months. There was associated pain, no bleeding, and no loss of weight. Past history, she is a non-case of xeroderma pigmentosa. No history of any previous malignancies, biopsies, or surgeries in the past. Sun exposure was not restricted, or no sun-blocking agents were used. Family history, non-consanguineous marriage, no history of any diagnosed malignancies in the family. One sister is suffering from xeroderma pigmentosa. Menstrual history normal. General physical examination, there were multiple pigmented patchy lesions over skin, face, neck, and limbs. One cervical lymph node were palpable. Vitals and system examination were normal. On ocular examination, in the right eye, a conjunctival nevus was present, which was about 2 to 3 mm in size temporarily. Rest of the anterior segment examination and fundus were normal with visual acuity 6/6. Left eye was PL negative. On inspection of the left eye, there was a lesion in the left eye with marked edema of upper and lower lids. A fleshy growth in the left eye noted, which is 3.2 into 2 centimeter in size, involving whole ocular surface. It is lobulated, brownish black pigmented, and lids were edematous. So we came to a provisional diagnosis of pigmented OSSN with orbital extension, since it was far more common in xeroderma pigmentosa. We kept our differential diagnosis of malignant melanoma of conjunctiva with orbital extension. We proceeded with routine blood investigations, which are normal. The CT orbit in the axial section showed a marked periorbital swelling with edema extending up to equator of the globe. A surgery was performed, left eye subtotal excentration. This is a POD3 picture. And to our surprise, the histopathology showed it was malignant melanoma of conjunctiva. Here you can see the conjunctival epithelium, and below what we see is a neoplasm showing spindle cells with interlacing fascicles. This is a more close, high power view, and this showing the marked atypia of the cells and the pigment intracellularly, as well as the chromatin clumps in the nucleus. This is a scanner view of the same, showing scleral infiltration. So metastasis workup was done by the oncologist. CT chest, CT neck, CT abdomen, and MRI brain. The CT neck showed lymph nodes. So we came to a final diagnosis of malignant melanoma of conjunctiva in xeroderma pigmentosa. AGCC T staging clinical was T3C, pathological P-T3. Aphasia of cervical lymph nodes level 2 on the left side was planned, and AGCC M staging is M0. Treatment, patient was referred to an oncologist for further management, started on adjuvant chemotherapy, oral temozolomide, advised sun protection, and advised regarding early presentation if any lesion developed, and regular follow-up. So why this case?
1 minute left.
Xeroderma pigmentosa increases the risk of skin melanoma of more than 2,000 folds over 20 years of age. Ocular melanoma is a rare association of xeroderma pigmentosa. Conjunctival melanoma by itself is a rare malignancy and an extremely rare association of xeroderma pigmentosa. So we present such a case. Prevention of this neoplasms lies in evidence of UV radiation exposure from sunlight. Many of the patients, including our patient, had little knowledge about the disease and importance of UV radiation. She is one among the neglected girl child from poverty-stricken marginalized society. Never consulted a doctor regarding her skin lesions. This emphasizes the importance of health assessment drives at grassroots level. As the corona pandemic was worsening, an intensive lockdown was enforced with strict travel bans to control the epidemic. So this had a direct impact on ocular oncology practice. Since the patient was from a remote place, she could not approach appropriate healthcare at right time. This costed her patient's eye. This is the data from our hospital. The enucleation or excision performed for malignant tumors, except for RB. In the pre-lockdown period, we can see 4 cases in 14 months, whereas 6 cases in 10 months were seen post-lockdown. A sharp increase of additional 110% or 2.1 times increase in enucleation or excision for malignant tumors of the eye compared to the pre-COVID times. These are my references. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Maya. You can stop sharing screen now. Over to judges.
Good presentation, Dr. Maya.
Thank you, sir.
Do you know what is the survival rate of this tumor?
The survival rate actually depends upon the metastasis and local metastasis. So here,
so what is the historical survival rate after 5 years and 3 years?
Of 3-year rate, it is about 20% death. I mean, 80% survival rate, sir. and 5 years it is about 30 means 70%, sir. And if there is a local recurrence, it reduces a survival rate, sir. Like in 2 years, 40% death can the death rate is 40%, sir. In
Okay,
lymph node,
your lead to second question again. What is the recurrence rate?
Recurrence rate.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
recurrence rate is 40%, sir, in 2 years.
Okay. So, what is the incidence of tumor? You are told in ocular melanoma it is around 5%. What is incidence in all tumors of the body?
I don't know, sir.
Okay. Okay. ठीक है. Over to Renu ma'am.
Yes. What kind of inheritance is there in this condition?
Autosomal recessive, ma'am, but we couldn't find that in this case.
All right. And what are the other ocular findings other than tumors? What other ocular findings can be there?
Usually in xeroderma pigmentosa ocular, usually it will be irritation of eyes and all, but as in case of tumors, it usually will be SCC, BCC.
No, other than tumors.
It will be ocular irritations. That is the most common one.
Yes, and lid deformities also, along with your lid position deformities, corneal deformities also. Okay, thank you.
Over to Rupa ma'am.
Yes. What is differential diagnosis of such type of tumors?
Ma'am, since xeroderma pigmentosa, it's OSSN more common, so we kept it as pigmented OSSN, ma'am, since it was blackish brown pigmented.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Good.
Okay, Dr. Sumit.
If judges permit, I would like to ask a question.
Yeah.
Nice presentation, ma'am. I just wanted to ask, you found scleral infiltration on your histopathology. So your oncologist did not advise any EBRT or radiation to the orbit?
No, they didn't advise. Actually, we planned for a FNAC of lymph nodes. Other than that, they've started on temozolomide for 6 weeks to counter any CNS metastasis to prevent. Other than that, no.
Okay. And what was the
And
last
if
follow-up?
they're planned for if any local recurrence is there, radiotherapy is planned, sir, in the next follow-up.
It's better if you give prior to recurrence, because that can prevent recurrence instead of waiting for it. And
Yes,
secondly, what was the last follow-up? Like how much duration from the surgery?
2 months, 1 month after that, sir. But after that, the patient couldn't come. She went back to her state. So
if you can contact her back, it would be good for her. Anyway, nice presentation, nice case. You can make a series of this. Basically, there are very less cases reported with the xeroderma pigmentosa with conjunctival tumors. And if you can just compile a case series and present, that would be good. So we'll move ahead with the next, Dr. Karishma Shah. She will be document comparison of water drinking test and a modified diurnal tension curve. You can make it full screen and start presenting, Dr. Karishma.
Good evening, everyone. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. So I will be talking about the comparison of water drinking test and modified diurnal tension curve, results of these two tests in primary open angle glaucoma patients on latanoprost and bimetoprost. We all know that the diagnosis of primary open angle glaucoma is based on the measurement of IOP with Goldman's, visualization of the optic disc, and evaluation of the visual field. Now, the peaks and diurnal variation of IOP have been shown as risk factors for glaucomatous progression. The diurnal tension curve, in this we assess IOP in relationship to either as a risk factor for the development or progression of glaucoma, or for the achievement of a target pressure which may direct a therapeutic change. So as we see, normally the peak IOP occurs in the early morning at around 7 a.m. and by mid morning it dips down. Now the modified or the office diurnal tension curve is wherein IOP is measured every 2 to 3 hours only during the office hours, which is like from 8 to 5 or 9 to 5. And this may provide better information regarding the IOP profile than a single IOP measurement. The other test which I did is the water drinking test. We all know it is a provocative test wherein the patient is asked to drink around 1 liter of water over a period of 5 to 10 minutes. And after that, after 15 minutes after drinking water, the IOP is measured at 15 minutes intervals. So we see that the point of increased resistance is generally near the trabecular meshwork. This evaluates the eye's ability to deal with a transient IOP elevation by observing how high the IOP rises and how long it takes to return to baseline. Normally, a rise of 6 to 8 millimeter mercury is considered positive for a diagnosis of glaucoma. This is how it was as a provocative test. The main reason, the aim of water drinking test is to stress the trabecular meshwork by increasing the episcleral venous pressure. Now, in our study, we compared two drugs. One is bimatoprost 0.03% and the second is latanoprost 0.005%. Both of these are prostaglandin analogs, which increase the uveoscleral pathway. But bimatoprost is also known to contribute to the conventional trabecular pathway. The aims of our study, we compared the peak IOP and the rise of IOP from baseline during both these tests achieved during the use of both the prostaglandins, bimatoprost and latanoprost, in 2 eyes of the same patient with symmetrical damage. And then we analyzed the efficacy of both drugs in blunting the IOP spike. We also wanted to establish the importance of the water drinking test in the present day scenario. So we had 31 patients, 62 eyes. Inclusion criteria were basically patients with bilateral symmetric mild to moderate POAG who had similar IOPs in both eyes to start with and who were controlled on monotherapy prior to our intervention. Exclusion criteria were all the above. All of them underwent a basic history, best corrected visual acuity, slit lamp biomicroscopy, gonioscopy, disc examination with a +78 diopter lens, IOP with a Goldman's applanation tonometer, central corneal thickness, and visual field testing. All these subjects were started on bimatoprost in the right eye and latanoprost in the left eye, and they were followed up after 3 weeks, which is when we did the modified diurnal tension curve. So the IOP was measured at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., 1 p.m., 3 p.m., and 5 p.m. And then we did the water drinking test. So basically, most of our patients were in the age group of 51 to 60 years, and most of them were males. The IOP, so when we checked the IOP at different time intervals in the modified diurnal tension curve, there was not, there was no definitive peak at a particular time. It was more at 5 p.m., but it was not very conclusive. On the other hand, the water drinking test showed a definitive peak at around 45 minutes to 60 minutes in both the eyes. And when we checked the difference between the peak and the baseline IOP with the modified diurnal tension curve, the difference, so there was a significant difference when we checked the right eye, which was on bimatoprost, and the left eye on latanoprost, and the fluctuation was lesser in the right eye. And the same thing we saw even with the water drinking test, that the fluctuation was lesser in the right eye. Here, as you can see, it is 4.93, and in the left eye, it was 6.45. The IOP peaks. So basically, there were peaks. The IOP peaked during both the tests, but the peaks of both did not correspond. And the peak of the water drinking test was always more than
1 minute left.
So basically, we concluded that the right eye on bimatoprost showed a lower peak IOP, a lower difference between the peak and the baseline IOP in both the tests, and hence bimatoprost has a more IOP lowering efficacy. Water drinking test is not a replacement, but it is a good alternative to the 24-hour diurnal tension curve, and it is useful to assess the status of the eye's outflow facility and to determine the IOP peaks and fluctuations. This could be routinely missed in the routine clinic IOP measurements. It had a few limitations. We checked the IOP only after 9 a.m., but most IOP peaks occur between 5 and 7 a.m. A larger sample size could have been more beneficial, and also documenting perimetric damage for prognostic outcome would have helped. I have a few recommendations. We can compare the efficacy of different IOP lowering drugs with water drinking test as a stress test to question the facility of outflow. and it can use to determine the IOP peaks in apparently controlled patients with documented disc damage in lieu of facility or logistics for a full diurnal record. It can also be used as an additional tool to identify progressors despite good IOP control. Thank you.
You can stop your presentation. Yeah, over to judges.
Yes, good presentation, Karishma.
Thank you, sir.
So, what precautions will you take while doing water drinking test?
So actually, it is not advisable in patients who are prone to fluid overload conditions, CCF patients and lung failure patients. And we advise them not to drink water for not drink too much water, at least before 2 hours before we start the test.
This was a supervised test or the patient has been done by themselves?
No, sir, supervised in the OPD.
Okay. How much was the time lag between water drinking test and this diurnal test?
Diurnal test was done from the whole day, 5 readings, and after the diurnal test, the water drinking test was done.
So that is my question. After how much time?
After around 15 minutes, I started the water drinking test on the same day.
On the same day?
Yes, after the last reading of the diurnal tension. After the last reading, I did the water drinking test.
So water drinking test is done at one time only in a day.
Sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Over to Renu, ma'am.
So what is the best time to do a water drinking test actually?
Ma'am, as far as all the studies which have been done previously, they have all been done in this fashion. Like the water drinking test was done after the diurnal tension. There's no specific time mentioned in studies, at least, to do the water drinking test.
And can the sudden intake of water, can that cause damage in a predisposed person?
Yes, ma'am. But this study was on open angle patients. So
yes, even that can give a sudden spike, no? If your the outflow is hampered, can that give rise to any damage to the eye?
Yes, ma'am, can. If there's a sudden rise.
It was consent taken for this?
But because they were on therapy for 3 weeks before we did the test, so their pressures did not rise too much. Also because they were on prostaglandin analogs, which are anyway known to increase the outflow facility. The water drinking test has always shown lower peaks in patients on prostaglandin analogs. The peaks are higher, in fact, if they are on beta blockers or any other class of anti-glaucoma medications.
Okay, thank you.
Was it a clinical trial?
Yes, sir.
Karishma?
Yes,
was
sir.
it clinical trial?
It was, yes, I mean, it was a study which we did, not a registered trial.
What do you mean by clinical trial? What is the study?
It was it was not.
Okay, okay. Have you taken consent before doing
Yes,
this
sir.
test?
Yes, sir. Informed consent was taken. The patients were explained about the procedure.
You have mentioned in your study?
Sir?
Have you mentioned in your study consent about the consent?
In my study, I have mentioned, sir. In the PPT, I have not mentioned. They were given a patient-informed consent, and they were made to sign up.
So you should mention in PPT now, so that we can understand.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Over to Rupa, ma'am.
Hi, Karishma.
Hello.
So what about the low tension glaucoma? Is it helpful in low tension glaucoma cases, this water drinking test and these drug studies?
Yes, ma'am, because low tension glaucoma, usually we feel they are low tension because we mention only one IOP in the clinic. But this can detect peaks that are not detected in the routine OPD routine OPD.
Okay.
So which may appear to be low tension may actually have peaks which are not detected. So
okay. So it is means useful.
Yes, ma'am.
Low tension glaucoma. Okay, good.
Okay, over to Sumit, Dr. Sumit.
Okay, yes. So with all the due permission from the judges, we have finished the all talks of this session. But Dr. Gaurav was supposed to present in the last session in the Kansky Hall, but there was some technical glitch because of which he could not present. So if with the judges' permit, can he present in this session?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, ma'am, is it fine?
Yes, yes,
Yes.
please go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Gaurav, you can start presenting.
Yes, sir. Sir, am I audible, sir?
Very much, you are very much audible. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
Good evening, everybody. I'll be talking about intraocular ossification and incidental finding during evisceration. Intraocular bone formation is a rare phenomenon. However, osseous metaplasia may occur in physis bulbae, usually in cases who are having long-standing history of trauma or any surgical intervention. Hereby, we report a case series of 6 patients with extensive vitreous ossification. All the patients underwent a preoperative B scan and histopathological examination revealing bone formation. This young man presented to the OPD with history of injury to the left eye almost 10 years back and desiring cosmetic correction. The right eye was within normal limits. The left eye was phthisis bulbae. It denied any perception of light and there were slight proptosis. On CT imaging, there was a hyperdense foci in the posterior segment, which was likely to be calcification. The patient was planned for a 4-petal evisceration with a polymethyl methacrylate implant. On the intra finding was a osseous vitreous that was found. This gentleman came to the OPD with complaints of disfigurement of the left eye and also gave history of blunt trauma to the left eye almost 20 years back, desiring cosmetic correction. Was again planned for a 4-petal evisceration with a non-integrated PMMA implant. After separation of the uveal contents, there was a gray to brown hard irregular mass which clinically appeared to be bone. On histopathological examination of the eviscerated contents, there was extensive loss of architecture and normal distortion of the normal ocular histology. The hard mass revealed a mature compact lamellar bone with adipose tissue ruling out any differentials like foreign body or tumors. Similar case of this lady who presented again to the OPD with the history of trauma almost 10 years back, planned for evisceration, showed intra-operative ossified vitreous. This young man presented to the OPD with complaints of pain in the right eye. He had documents of some right eye retinal band buckle surgery and silicone oil implantation, desiring cosmetic correction. The anterior segment examination of the right eye revealed band-shaped keratopathy, corneal opacification, due to which the anterior chamber details were not visible. The left eye was within normal limits. The B scan of the right eye showed a short anterior posterior diameter and hyperreflective echo suggestive of calcification. Was planned for a 4-petal evisceration. Similarly, 2 patients undergoing a posterior segment surgery for retinal detachment and silicone oil implantation with band buckle of history of around 10 years back, presenting with phthisis bulbae, undergoing 4-petal evisceration with custom-made prosthesis for cosmetic correction. The discussion, the incidence of intraocular osseous metaplasia remains to be approximately around 5% of all the enucleated eyes in 2 large studies, trauma being the most common stimulus. The associations can be embryological, organizational, metaplastic. The determined cellular precursors for bone formation are present in the bone marrow. However, the retinal pigment epithelium is a pluripotent cell layer in which which can differentiate into fibroblast or osteoblast depending on the inducible agents, which can lead to a pre-retinal, subretinal ossification. However, the process of bone formation can be a chronic end-stage disease of ocular inflammation, release of interleukins, stimulation of the RPE layer, laying down of bone matrix by osteoprogenitor cells, and primary spongy bone formation finally being replaced by a lamellar bone. This study supports our finding of intraocular ossification being an uncommon calcium deposition process associated with trauma, chronic inflammation, tumor, and long-standing retinal detachment. In summary, intraocular osseous metaplasia is rare. Finkelstein and Bovnik enucleated around 2,400 eyes, out of which only 119 showed calcification. The cause and source of bone formation in each and every individual case can vary. In our case series, the association was trauma and posterior segment intervention, surgical intervention, both having a history of almost more than 10 years, leading to phthisis bulbi and intraocular disorganization. The take-home message: the knowledge of posterior segment calcification is important for keeping in mind the differentials in posterior pole affections. These could be mistaken for an intraocular foreign body or malignancy. A timely silicone oil removal is advocated, and histopathological evaluation is mandatory
1
for
minute
the
left.
and enucleated specimen to confirm the presence of any immature or differentiated tissues. Thank you.
Dr. Gaurav, please stop sharing us. Over to the judges.
Good presentation, Dr. Gaurav.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, it is a nice and unique study you have presented. So, any more references you have with this study?
Sir, there was one study, with the largest study that I already have cited, Finkelstein and Bovnik. And there was a similar study done by Dr. Honavar and Mehboob, in which they had histopathologically, out of 151 enucleated eyes, they had seen only 8 eyes in which there was calcification that was present. There was one more study that was done by Monsleys and et al., and trying to find out as to what kind of ocular ossification can lead to due to which insult. So they found out that a compact bone can be seen in cases which were giving history of trauma, and a spongy bone can be found in patients who are giving any kind of history of post-inflammatory disorder or any kind of pathology.
Excellent, excellent. Over to Renu ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
You have done evisceration in these cases.
Yes, ma'am.
Have you come across any other series of eviscerations done where you have this? You've quoted the enucleations.
Yes, ma'am. There was only one case that I came across. There was one study that was done in South Asia, in which they have only cited one female who underwent evisceration and was around 22-year-old female and having history of trauma.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Over to Rupa ma'am. Rupa ma'am.
Good presentation. No question, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Dr. Dia, please share your first slide so that we can know your details.
Yes,
because we don't have a detail.
Sir, it's Dr. Gaurav Patil presenting a case of.
He can share just first slide only.
Yeah, just show your title.
Yes. So that we can take the screenshot and share it.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes,
thank you,
sir.
Sunil.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Gaurav, and thank you all the participants
Thank you,
for presenting and staying with us till long last session of the hall. Thank you, judges. We can't thank you enough for giving your time and being with us and having such an interactive discussion. I thank you on behalf of MOS and BOA.